The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer. St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on the Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Politically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, as always, Chris McDaniel, a reporter with St. Louis Public Radio. Joining me in studio today is
Jason Rosenbaum of the St. Louis Beacon.
Joe Manis of the St. Louis Beacon.
And our guest this week is Republican Representative
John Diehl.
He's also the House Majority Leader.
I am the House Majority Leader. That's correct.
Starting us off here, we normally like to have our guests sort of introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about themselves and the district in which they serve.
Sure, absolutely. Well, as we've talked about, I'm the House Majority Floor Leader. My job in the General Assembly is to control the calendar on the floor. That is, which bills come up for debate and how long they get on the floor, and basically how bills move once they get out of committee and pass the Speaker's office. I represent the central part of St. Louis County. My district runs roughly from Lindbergh Boulevard west to just past 141. It runs from Ladue Road down to just approximately Doherty Ferry, a little bit south of there. So I'm a lifelong resident of that general area. Grew up about 5 miles west of my district.
Really?
And I haven't moved too far. And I've actually been involved in politics since high school. So
Key question.
Sure. No, DeSmet.
Did you go to school with Eric Schmidt?
We have 3 DeSmet people in the General Assembly: Tom Dempsey, Eric Schmidt, and me. I'm actually the senior of the bunch.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah. I've got the most gray. They're big, important senators, but I have a little more gray on both of them.
And did you get your law degree from SLU or University of Missouri or somewhere else?
St. Louis University.
So you're also in
well, I attended undergrad at University of Missouri,
mm-hmm.
Columbia, and then my
Good
law
choice.
degree at St. Louis University. Go Tigers. We'll see how they do in the SEC this year.
Probably pretty poorly.
Hopefully better than
I know they say they have their line together and they're gonna
Who knows?
be a little more force on the ground this year. So we hope that's the case. It was painful to watch last year.
So if I'm not mistaken, you're John Diehl Jr., and I think your dad has been involved in local politics for a while, and you were actually, I think, a town and country alderman or councilman before you got into the State House. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I actually started politics back when I was in high school at the township level, stuffing envelopes for John Ashcroft and walking doors for Roy Blunt when he ran for governor back in 1992. I dropped out of it for a while. And then I decided to run for Town and Country Board of Aldermen back in 2003. Mm-hmm. Served a term there. And then Governor Blunt appointed me to chair the St. Louis County Election Board.
Yeah, he held the post during some rather volatile times when they switched voting machines and a number of things in St. Louis County.
Right. Yeah, it was pretty. When we took over, we were pretty far behind the curve in terms of implementing the federal requirements for new voting equipment. So we were able to get that done and pushed through, and I think stabilized. So that's something I'm pretty proud of.
My big memory of that is primary night, 2008, Hillary Clinton versus Barack Obama, and they were initially calling the state for Hillary Clinton, and you were on CNN telling them, no, we're still counting, and we haven't finished counting the first district because you called me. I worked at the Post-Dispatch then, and you said that the Nationals were incorrectly calling Missouri for Hillary Clinton, and that it would be Barack Obama. And you were right.
That's right. You've got to look. One of the things that really changed for political junkies looking at results, there used to be a midday count, which was about 30% of the ballots counted across 100% of the precincts. So you could get a representative sample of what the county and the state look like. Well, with the new equipment, there is no more midday count. So when you get 30% of the precincts reporting, it's 30% of 100% of the precincts. So it's no longer representative. So when you're watching election results on election night, you have to pay really, really close attention to where they're coming from.
To the map.
Correct.
one of the biggest stories that we've been following and one that we've been asking most of our guests about is 253, House Bill 253, the income tax cut bill. Nixon has been out in full force against this. Just yesterday, I saw a news report from KMA Radio that another House GOP member has dropped support. You need 109 votes in the House in order to override Nixon's veto, and you have 109 GOP members. How does it look like this math is going to play out? First
of all, I think I think the math is going well.
Okay,
actually,
and you've got the caucus. We should say this
yes.
weekend.
So we'll talk about this weekend. I mean, one, I think all this talk is premature. I've been able to help engineer 2 veto overrides, both with 109 votes. Okay, the first was the congressional maps back in 2011. After the end of that session.
Although you had 4 Democrats who helped you
we
that
had 4 Democrats that crossed
and you
over.
had 6 Democrats for the contraception bill, which I think you're about to explain.
That's correct. And the second was a contraception bill. Both passed with 109. What I would tell and caution everybody is anyone who makes predictions on what happens on a veto override 1 month before it happens probably doesn't have a real good sense of what's going on. Anything can and does happen on veto overrides. I think you have to look very, very closely at the statements people are making. Just because someone says they have a concern with it or they would do it a different way does not mean that they will not vote to override a veto. And so I think sometimes people jump on statements made by members that may or may not be taken out of context, that may or may not have certain subtleties in it. I could have concerns about it, but I could still vote for something. I think if the vote were held today, I think the votes would be there. But I think it'll be difficult. But I know the speaker is working on it, and I think any predictions before the vote happens, people end up being sick. First of all, you have to just make sure that everyone's there that day. I know when we did the veto override, we had one member. We had it all on the congressional maps. We had one member that was the night before had a heart attack and was admitted to the hospital in Jefferson City. Well, he left the next morning to come sit in his chair to vote. If he didn't do that, we wouldn't have been able to override it.
And on the other bill, you actually, I think, had 2 Republicans who had lost state Senate primaries who effectively took a walk on that bill and didn't vote because they were mad at Missouri Right to Life.
And then another Republican who was a no flipped his vote to yes.
Yes.
So my point being is that this is when we have we caucus every year. When you have 109 members, you have 109 members who have 109 opinions. So that happens this week.
And at the Westin, isn't it?
Correct. Yes. So that'll be a topic of discussion, and we'll take into account all the comments and concerns of members, and we'll talk through the issues and talk through the information which is out there and why the proponents of this believe that information is incorrect, and then we'll see where we are.
Do you expect a fairly spirited discussion?
Well, I mean it's we don't despite what the media likes to portray, all 109 of us don't think alike. There are 109 people who are leaders in their community that have their own support networks and their own way of coming to the beliefs that they hold. So yes, at times it gets spirited, but we always look at it as a debate which is within the family, and I think generally speaking they're good faith, reasonable discussions, and we're generally able to work through those issues.
Now, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning of this topic, those other 2 veto overrides had Democratic votes to them. Mm-hmm. And as of now, publicly, out of the 3 Democrats that voted for this bill, 2 have pretty much emphatically said they're not overriding, with one, Jeff Rorta of Jefferson County, kind of on the fence. Do you think that Democrats could potentially help override this bill, or is this going to be a completely Republican effort in your view?
I think it would be very, very difficult, particularly for those Democrats who are in Senate seats in Republican-leaning or Republican-trending areas, to vote against it. Once again, I think it's premature to take a look at what they say now versus what they do 1 month from now. If you asked me a month before we did the congressional override veto, I would have the common knowledge would be that's why the governor vetoed it. He didn't
Right.
think we'd get the Democrats, and we did.
Now, now the governor yesterday, Chris and I were both there. He was particularly hammering at the prescription drug angle, the fact that the tax cut bill does eliminate the exemption for sales tax for prescription drugs, and he was at a pharmacy. And how volatile of an issue is that?
I don't think it's that volatile. I mean, this is language which came from Nixon's DOR.
Now they dispute that.
Well, I know they dispute that, as they probably should, since they gave it to us, and reviewed it. I think this falls under the category of what Nixon's done, and he's not a stranger to politics. He's gone through, and they've focused groups, and if they go into different districts, they have a different message to try to scare those members and not voting the other way. There's some places in the western part of the state where there were things appropriated in the budget that the towns or the counties were all excited about. They'd schedule a press conference to announce it, then he'd cancel it the day before, say, I'm sorry, I'm withholding that money for this project because of 253. 253 has been blamed for everything in the world by the governor. It's been blamed for the education funding. They've been blamed on prescription drugs. Next thing we know, he's going to blame global warming on 253. It's just one of these things where everything that's wrong with the state or will be wrong with the state in the future, the governor's blaming on 253. I don't think that's sustainable, and we're out addressing the misinformation which is out there.
Yeah, I noticed that there's more. Are you guys sending more Republicans out to these events? Actually,
Oh, absolutely.
That's what my story was today.
Yeah, so we're doing that as a caucus, and when he puts out misinformation on each of these topics, there are clear talking points that explain why that's not correct, and people pushing back on that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some other bills that are going to come up in veto session. When we had Speaker Jones on the show, he seemed pretty sure that
The
Doe Run bill would be overridden. Are you looking at the same numbers? Does that look like it's one that's going to be
I think that's another
easy?
classic example. One of the mistakes that just the outsiders look at on what happens is, it's a good place to start, don't get me wrong, but what was the vote when it passed?
Right.
Okay, well, our congressional maps only had 90-something votes when it passed, yet people voted for it on the override that didn't vote for it on third reading. I think you've got the same situation here. I think that's a bill which we will look at taking a run at, so to speak, on the bad cliche. I think there's a good chance it gets there as more information gets out at how important this bill is to the economy of Jefferson County and southeast Missouri. And I think when some of that information gets out, I think it puts that bill in play.
And then there's the gun nullification. I mean, what they call the gun. I mean,
Second
nullification.
Amendment,
Basically,
Act,
it's
gun nullification.
Right. It's preventing enforcement of federal gun laws in the state.
Well, it does more than just that. But,
Okay.
But it also deals with the publishing of gun registries and papers like they did in New York. I think the information the governor's put out on that is just very, very strained and incorrect. I think that's a bill which will have a strong chance of being overridden.
Now, the person who put forth that particular amendment told me last week that he thinks that even it went too far and he might seek to change it next session. Have you heard that?
I think he said if it did. I don't think he conceded that it did. So once again, I think that's the interpretation of you're not going to publish the name of a gun owner is very, very strained to say you're violating that or breaking the law because you take a picture of someone who shot a deer. That's just silly.
I guess that's for the courts to decide.
Correct.
Potentially.
What other bill? Are there any other bills that we haven't been mentioning that you think will probably?
Well, I mean, there's
be
a list.
concerned
Obviously, every
on the
member,
override. Right?
Sure, every member who's had their bill overridden,
Right.
will want to try to take a run at getting it overridden, and that's something that we sit down and we talk about at caucus. So I have to imagine at the end of the day, when we look at the vote counts, we look at the case for overriding. Some of it is whether or not it's a Senate bill or a House bill. The way that works, if it's a House bill, the House has to vote first. So if the House does not override the veto on 253, the Senate never votes on it. Likewise with the Senate bill, if the Senate can't override
Right.
a veto, then the House never gets to vote on it. So my guess would be at the end of the day, there's going to be 5, 6, 7 bills that are in play.
Okay. Joe, that might mean both of us have to go to veto session.
To see what gets out and what doesn't. That's right.
Well, I wanted to ask you kind of about a narrative that's been floating since the General Assembly adjourned in May. And
Especially lately.
And obviously, I don't think you hang out at Democratic Party functions that much. And if you do, that would surprise me. But this is the common...
They usually don't invite me.
You're usually not invited. But people like Claire McCaskill, like Minority Leader Jake Hummel, have been putting forth the argument that since the legislature sent 3 bills in particular to Nixon's desk, the Second Amendment Preservation Act, the one dealing with Agenda 21, and the one dealing with foreign law, it's a showcase that the legislature is extreme, dealing with frivolous issues and issues that aren't as important as they should be. I'm sure you've heard that argument. I wanted, as leadership, a chance for you to respond to that argumentation.
I think it's a silly argument, and for Senator McCaskill, with all due respect, to make that argument about the Missouri General Assembly being irresponsible is almost
she was using
laughable.
the phrase saying you guys were a bunch of Todd Aiken wannabes.
Yeah, well, let's take a look at what we do.
Okay.
As the Missouri General Assembly, we cut taxes.
Okay.
We have policies which cut regulations on small businesses. And Senator McCaskill, we actually balance our budget, and we balance it every year, and we manage our finances in a fiscal manner. And we actually pass a budget. I don't know the last time the Senate that Senator McCaskill sits in actually passed a budget. I think last time we actually passed a budget at the federal level, the iPads that we all work on today hadn't even been invented yet. And then we also, approach health care in a fiscally responsible manner. One of the things that we're being asked to do is to expand Medicaid because of the Affordable Care Act, and the federal government can't decide from month to month to month what its policy is going to be with regard to the Affordable Care Act. Like they expect the states,
what's going to be enforced.
Right. So they expect the states to take a blind leap of faith to commit potentially hundreds of millions of dollars of future revenue to something that the federal government can't even implement the most basic tenets of. So I guess if that's irresponsible or extreme, then I guess we're guilty. I think it's probably the federal government and the policies of the Obama administration which are irresponsible and extreme.
Well, now, she contends, though, that she says the state wouldn't have been able to balance the budgets in 2009, 10, or 11 without federal money. So
I don't. we would have balanced the budget either way.
Okay.
And more importantly, we would have passed a budget, which the federal
point.
government has not done.
Well, I mean, I followed the legislature for 5 or 6 years, and I know that the legislature passes more than 3 bills. They passed probably, 160 this year, and many of them were non-controversial. Right. But do you think that those 3 bills in particular kind of marred the other accomplishments that the legislature did, or were distractions for other big things?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, it's anytime you pass 100 or so bills, it's pretty easy for people to come on. But I actually don't think, like, for example, the Agenda 21 bill that people talk about is a bad bill. Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, it's a bill that essentially, keeps local governments from implementing as a matter of law things which are changed at a higher level. And I'm going to give you a great example of that, and that comes with fire sprinkler systems.
Okay.
Okay. Everybody thinks it's a big conspiracy, but it's not. If you go to most local municipal codes, okay, they implement something called the International Building Code as their standard. Okay. Well, the International Building Code standard, some of the fire sprinkler interests put in a mandate that all residential construction has to be mandated with sprinklers. Well, that automatically changes, okay, all the local codes requiring that.
Well, it also changes the real estate.
Absolutely.
Prices. Yeah.
So prices and the cost of new homes. And so that's a mandate which is put in place by an international body, and it's put in place just because our cities and towns implement the standards of that code as part of their local laws. So to sit there and just laugh it off that what happens at a national or international level doesn't have effect on our local laws is just putting your head in the sand, because it does. You see this too with some of the blue lining of rivers and streams where people can build and not build on their properties. A lot of that starts much, much higher up, and it becomes law in our cities and towns because of their adoption of that. So like on the sprinkler system, what we had to do is come in and pass a law to say that that is not going to be enforced here.
So is that considered, is that kind of an example of Agenda 21?
Well, it's an example of things which can happen.
Okay.
So it's not, I know it's easy to make fun of something which has the word agenda behind it, but the some of the policies behind it are real and do have an impact.
So I guess, we're flying through some of these topics pretty quickly. So
fastest 2 minutes in radio.
Fastest 2 minutes in radio. You have experience in this from what I tell. But I do want to kind of get we've asked pretty much everybody about the transfer situation, which has become a really big issue here and probably might become a big issue in Kansas City.
Yeah, school transfers. Yes.
We pretty much asked all of our guests like what they think the legislature should do in the next session, and we're going to give you the same opportunity.
Sure. Well, actually, the legislature did something last session. It was called Senate Bill 125. And what Senate Bill 125 did was to allow DESE to not have to wait the 2 years after a school becomes unaccredited to come in and appoint a special administrative board. Okay. Now, that law goes into effect August 28th. There's not much we can do about that. That's in the Constitution. But it also allows a special administrative board to also contract with outside entities to come in and run the school district that it takes over, among other things. In these immediate cases we have, there's nothing to stop DESE from appointing a special administrative board and announcing it's going to do that effective August 28th.
Would that prevent some of these transfers?
Well, I think it could because it gives more flexibility and option. And what's particularly, as far as I can tell, DESE and the Castro have just put their heads in the sand and say, we're not going to deal with this until next year. We're going to let it fly out. They put out a policy on transfers, approved the transfers, allowed the transfers to happen on the very first day the transfers start. They say, oh, by the way, we don't have the money to pay for this, and we can't pay the receiving school districts unless and until the legislature appropriates more money because Normandy is going to run out. That can certainly be avoided. Why we're spending $30 million to transfer kids from one district to another does not one thing for improving the education of those children. The DESE and the state DESE has to show more leadership on this and be more forceful on how this goes. We've given them the tools to do it. They've declined to exercise those tools.
So could there be a big legislative fight over whether or not to allocate this extra money? Could that become kind of
I think I think it's going to be very difficult to. I would not support throwing more money just to bus kids around.
So then what happens?
Counties. Well, I think DESE's going to have to do its job. It's going to have to come in, appoint a special administrative board, and use those funds that are now being used to ship kids all across 2 different counties right now to actually putting it into improving the education outcomes in those districts.
What about the particular statute in question, which has been kind of the source of this fury about the unaccredited districts being forced to, pay for transportation and tuition? I think there's some sense that there might not be enough consensus to find ways to change that law. Is that your view, or do you think there could be a change to that?
Well, it's I guess it depends on what the change is and what the outcome is. Right now, I think there are tools in place to deal with the size and scope of the situation that we have. It's just a question of DESE stepping up to do their job, to try to make sure that the outcomes are in the best interest of the kids. And I always think it's in the best interest of kids that they're educated locally.
One of the things that cooperating school districts has said about this 20-year-old law is that what they say is it's very vague, and that it says that students can transfer from unaccredited districts to accredited ones, but it doesn't really set guidelines for those transfers. So DESE made guidelines saying that you had to register by a certain date. Now it seems like the ACLU and the NAACP might sue because those guidelines aren't within the actual law, so they're questioning the legality of it. Does that seem like something the legislature will come back and set guidelines for?
I think, this is a situation I don't think, anyone actually thought would get to this situation. So I think there'll be discussion, and probably robust discussion, on what needs to happen. What the outcome of that is, I don't know at this point.
Now, so this kind of moves on to the next question. You've got some pretty decisive views on a number of these things. You are a contender, a major contender, to, within the next month, the Republicans are going to elect a speaker in waiting, in effect, who would then
we call a speaker designee.
Yeah, who would then take over in 2015, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so you're running. So is State Rep Caleb Jones.
Correct.
From Southwest Missouri. How do you see
Central
it?
Missouri.
He's from
Central.
Columbia.
I'm sorry. So how do you see this contest right now?
Oh, look at it. It's once again, I think the outside media likes to make more of it than it is internally.
Those darn media.
Well, it does. I mean, it's palace intrigue.
Yes.
Our caucus, we as I said before, we have 109 people now who have 109 different opinions and different life experiences. Our members sit in their chairs every day. They know who does what. They know who stands for what. They know who they want to lead them during the next cycle through their re-elections, and to set policy and to be the spokesman for the caucus going forward. Those caucus members will make their decisions based upon their own experiences, and whatever happens in the end, we will pull together as we always do and move forward as a team.
Is there a particular pitch that you're making?
Just that I'm qualified to do this, but Caleb's also qualified. He's a terrific caucus member. He'll be a valuable member going forward. As I said, our caucus members will make their decisions based upon their own personal experiences.
If you, for some reason, God forbid, in your opinion, don't become Speaker of the House, are you going to run for re-election to the House no matter what, or would you consider another office in 2014?
Oh, no, I'm running for re-election to the House. I mean, term limits are there for a reason. Mm-hmm. I intend to honor those limits. I have no desire to be in the General Assembly for 16 years. 8 years is enough for me in my life circumstance right now. And, I'll finish out my term and be a good team member and take it from there.
Because I was just thinking of visions of St. Louis County Executive John Diehl for a second, but I don't know if really that's an attractive job.
If I can say categorically no, that would be categorically
So John
no.
Diehl will not be a potential contender for a county executive in 2014?
Or a state Senate seat.
Or state Senate seat.
So.
Nope. House and out.
Breaking.
You've kind of been involved for a while in this debate over tax credits. You were involved in 2011 during that special session.
Major player
in economic development issue. But it seems like the House and the Senate just are always at loggerheads over this issue. And that might have been a pun in and of itself. What do you think this issue goes from here?
Oh, I would disagree that the bodies are at a jam up in this situation. I think I came pretty close to session once again. I think this is something we need to do, some level of tax credit reform in the state. While I'm honored to be saying I'm a major player in it, I don't think I'm the only player in it. In fact, this past session, I really wasn't involved in it much at all. The Ann Zare, who's our economic development chair, has done a terrific job on trying to get this issue resolved. I think she will continue working on that and try to get it resolved with Senator Dempsey in the Senate during the next cycle. And I think that the bodies are getting closer. I think for the most part the discussions are good faith discussions and that progress will be made.
And what would, if you had a magic wand and could craft tax credits any way you wanted, especially historic and low income, what would you want them to be at? Would you want just lower limits than they are now? Would you want to completely get rid of them, make new tax credits? What's kind of your philosophical approach?
Well, if I had a major wand, if I could start it all over to begin with, number one, I think we wouldn't have tax credits to begin with. We would simply eliminate personal and corporate income taxes. I think that's the best way to move forward with the economy and to move forward with attracting businesses to the state. So that's my magic wand to everything. To this, I think on the immediate issue, I think we need to make sure that the dollars that we spend are used in a way which shows the best rate of return to deal with the economic development issues we have. But I still want to stress the best economic development policy we can have are lower taxes, lower regulation, sound labor policies. And I think if we have those, then you'll see Missouri grow.
I think there was a lot of things that happened on the last day of the session, but one big thing that people noticed was Senator Brad Lager of Savannah calling the House corrupt on this issue. Even Senator Eric Schmidt said that it may have been too far, per se. But I think his implication was that the interests that want to keep the status quo on this issue, in his view, developers, banks, architects, have influenced members of the Senate and members of the House too much.
Well,
what do you make of that?
No, that's one. Senator's opinion, throwing a temper tantrum on the last day. I think every day, if you go back, for the past 10 years, there's somebody who throws a temper tantrum on the last day and hurls accusations.
So you don't think much of this temper tantrum?
I don't.
Right to work, you kind of hinted at this. Do you think right to work is going to come up next session?
Oh, I think we will have a discussion. I think it's one of those things that we need to look at to move the state forward.
To close it out here, you can read all of my stories at stlpublicradio.org. You can read all of Joe and Jason's stories at stlbeacon.org. You can follow me on Twitter at @CSMcDaniel. You can follow Jason on Twitter at
Jay Rosenbaum.
You can follow Joe on Twitter at
Jay Mannis. That's JMANNIES.
And you can follow the representative on Twitter at...
You know what? One of the things a smart politician does is not handle his own Twitter account. So, actually, you don't see any rogue tweets from me, but I can get that to you, and you can post it by the time you get here.
Very good.
You have a ghost tweeter?
We don't tweet much at all.
Oh, man, this is a scandal. But anyways.
We'll be back next week. Until then, so long.
So long.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.